Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Manoj Kumar. I'm the PTL for Trove. I work for IBM. My IRC is up there, Kumar MN. You can typically find me on IRC during our workday in the US. So what I thought I'd do today is spend a few minutes talking about Trove, give you some background on what Trove is, the kind of services it provides, and then go into what we've accomplished recently, and then what we're currently working on, and then after that, kind of things that are coming up in the future for Trove. I took over as PTL just 2 months ago from Amrit. Amrit had several cycles where he was the PTL. So I've been the PTL only since the PTG in Denver, so it's been only a couple of months. So I'm relatively new from that perspective as a leader of the project. But we've been working on it for several cycles on some private downstream versions of using Trove for products. So I do have quite a bit of background going back a couple of cycles. So what is Trove? Trove is database as a service for OpenStack clouds. It does the provisioning of databases. It does configuration management of a whole bunch of database instances. And it provides sort of a mechanism or an infrastructure to manage the lifecycle of a database. So it's not just the initial deployment, but it lets you resize the instance, resize the volumes that back the database, all the way down to tearing down the instance. It does depend on other OpenStack services. Nova for VMs. Trove primarily deploys into the guests are VMs, so it depends on Nova. It boots a standard image for a particular database, so the images are stored in glance, as you'd expect. Databases, when they get deployed, quite a few of them required extra volume, so we depend on Cinder for that database volume, and Swift for database backups. There are other dependencies as well, as you'd expect, Keystone and so on. I haven't listed them. It's not necessarily a complete list, but those are sort of the highlights. The databases supported currently, there are a dozen of them. Cassandra, Couchbase, CouchDB, DB2, which I think some of our folks at IBM were involved in getting that guest agent written, MariaDB, Mongo, MySQL, Percona, Postgres, clustering, and then Redis and Vertica. So about a dozen databases. I think that's stayed constant for this last few cycles. So sort of a high-level architecture. Trove lives in the control plane. In the OpenStack control plane, provides the services. It has certain other components that are part of Trove, the Trove Task Manager, a Trove Conductor. There's a piece of Trove that also lives in the database instance that get deployed into the VM that deploys, and that's called the guest agent. There is some other tooling sort of associated with Trove, not really part of the project wholesale, and those are imaging tools. And that continues to be a challenge. We continue to hear that building images for Trove is not that easy. There are a bunch of there are a bunch of disk image builder elements for them that got integrated as part of Trove a couple of cycles ago. But still, there's not a good, nice and easy way for building images, and that's one of the things that I got feedback here from the forum yesterday. That was something that I would like to work on to improve. To give you a real simple example, if you want to deploy a large MySQL instance with a 100 gigabyte store, volume, then Trove sort of orchestrates all the things that are necessary to accomplish that goal, which is go to Nova, spin up that large flavor, boot a MySQL image from Glance, allocate the necessary storage from Cinder, and then the necessary networking from Neutron, and spin up that instance, and the instance is live, and then you can just connect to the database. The Swift part of it, I think I kind of touched upon it. It really comes into later when you go into actually wanting to back up that instance. So the backup is stored in Swift. So fairly high level. The little bit of background on the code repositories for Trove. Then the main repo is under GitHub OpenStack Trove. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the integration, which was the disk image builder elements, were in a separate project called Trove Integration. Now that's been merged into the core repo. The Trove client is outside in a separate repo, and the Horizon plugin is in a separate repo as well. Next few slides, I'm not going to necessarily spend a whole lot of time on. I'm just going to run through them. But it gives you an idea of the kind of things that you can do with Trove, the kind of services it provides. So for instance management, for example, obviously the natural one is to create that instance. We talked a little bit about resizing as part of the life cycle. But Trove has this notion of creating a master and have multiple replicas. So you can do a promotion of a replica, you can detach a replica, delete instances, and so on. So a whole bunch of instance-related services. And then Trove has, if you're managing a bunch of instances of a particular database type, then Trove has this notion of a configuration group where you want to control all the instances to have a particular configuration, all the MySQL instances to have one standardized MySQL configuration file. So there's a bunch of configuration group related. I won't again walk through all of them, but just gives you some idea of what those are. With backups, you have this notion of getting a full backup, and that's typically what the native backup is for that database. And this is one of the places where the guest agent that lives in the instance gets involved as well to perform that backup. The backup, Trove supports both full and incremental backups. Another neat thing that I haven't really touched upon here is you can actually delete an instance and then spin up a completely new instance based on a backup that you've saved in Swift. So you sort of have a restore from a backup, but really, essentially get a completely new instance based on that backup. Under user management, so Trove does provide a little bit of database user management as well. So as you'd expect, create and delete users, some root user management as well. Trove is secure by default, which essentially means that when an instance gets deployed, the only port that's available is the port that's required to be connected to by that database. So it's that's the only port that's available. But Trove has this notion, which I think is a general notion of OpenStack of security groups. If you want to enable other ports, you can do that. Typically, probably not really recommended in public cloud environments, but there might be other cases for dev test where you want to, enable SSH or some other, ports. But so security groups is sort of the mechanism to do that. The other services, so you can create multiple databases in that single instance that you deploy. There's a whole bunch of flavor-related management as well, because Trove has its own separate database outside of Nova. So so those are services related with database and flavors. Clustering and replication, again, as you'd expect, creating clusters, extending, adding and deleting nodes to the cluster, and so on. Log management as well, some level of log management. So there's tons of services here that Trove provides, and I've only called out just a sample of them. I didn't mean to be exhaustive, but just give you a flavor for what Trove can do. The feature matrix, this might be a little out of date, but over the years it's been added to for various databases. In some cases, where the axes are, the feature is not available, it's not because the work hasn't been done. In some cases, it's just not relevant. For example, with Redis, it has no notion of users or schemas. So X doesn't necessarily mean it's not work we haven't done. It's just that it doesn't make sense. But there might be cases where we still need to improve this matrix. Okay, so switching gears now. So I was give you just a few minutes on the background of Trove. I'll touch upon the accomplishments for the Pike cycle. So Trove went through a fairly substantial change in the level of contributions and the nature of those contributions. A lot of the major players who were contributing to Go kind of stepped away from it. So the accomplishments might not look daunting to you, but these were the things that did get outdated. The documentation was severely lacking and out of date, and Trevor helped quite a bit in getting the documentation updates. Trevor also started on the migration to the OpenStack client. We do have a separate Python Trove client. The migration, I don't think, is by far complete, but at least the process of migrating off to the OpenStack client has started. So under the OpenStack client, it would be OpenStack database would be the way to get to it. Some work related to the Nova networking deprecation, user and database management on clusters, and I think Amrit completed this volume type support for the Trove client, if I remember. So those were the accomplishments for Pike. Just high-level stats on Pike. As I said, not as dramatic as previous releases. 103 commits, 31 K-logs changes, 33 contributors, and I want to give a shout out to the major contributors for Pike. Amrit in the room, Trevor, and so on. But as I said, Tesoro was one of the major players in this space, and they're going away from the community has definitely impacted the number of contributions, the number of contributors, as well as the number of commits. So if you compare this to previous cycles, you might see that this was not that of a major of a release. So what are we focusing on Queens during the Queen cycle? This is not meant to be a committed list. This is meant to be the things that we're actively working on. Some of them will get done. Some of them we might not get done. What we notice is that there are a lot of currency issues. A lot of the work on the database and the guest agents, the elements, we're all sort of lagging behind. Most of the development happened during the Trusty cycle, so Trusty was a major OS. So the update to Xenial has caused some pains, and that whole cycle, that we're in the sort of process. I think it's complete for several of the databases, but we want to go work through that for the others. The currency on the databases themselves, new versions of the databases are available, MySQL 5.7, Postgres 9.6, and so on. So we want to do sort of a refresh on the database versions as well. We talked a little bit about this yesterday at the forum, is to simplify the image creation. A lot of feedback we get still, and I kind of touched upon it. We do have some elements, but a big challenge still is creation and automation of a disk image for Trove, and the kind of thing we talked about is during the cycle we'd like to at least get sort of an automated procedure available. We'll start with just one database, one OS. That was a new goal that we came up with yesterday. Stability of the gate, I think, has been, there have been a lot of issues that we had to work through in this cycle, the migration to Zool v3 and associated things. So we had, quite a bit. I think there was probably several weeks where we were just banging our heads against the gate to get that get to pass. Other goals, policy and code goals. The most of Trove is Python 3 compliant, but the guest agent isn't. So we're going to look at making that compliant. We had to deal quite a bit of the Keystone v2 deprecation, though it was a series of unfortunate circumstances there as well. But that took us several weeks as well to get that sorted out. So those are the sort of focus areas for Queens. Looking at the stats for Queens, so this really is for the last couple of months, out of which we took a hit about 3 or 4 weeks with struggling with the gate and Zool migration issues. So it's kind of even though the commits and look low, there's a whole bunch queued up. So it's looking fairly positive in sort of seeing more contributions coming in. The nature of the contributions is smaller, so I haven't seen as large an impact on the number of lines of code. And the other thing I want to touch upon is the contribution by company thing. That you'll see has changed quite dramatically as well from the last cycle. So those are the stats for Queens. Major contributions from Sam and a few others that I've listed. Some of them have been constant over the years. So those are the stats for Queens. During the R cycle, or the Rocky cycle, we want to get some of the non-voting jobs working back again and move back to voting. I'd like to move some of those guest agents are tagged as experimental. As more and more testing goes into them, I'd like to get those promoted and to not be tagged as experimental anymore. We talked about that image creation. Sort of expand that tooling to provide more databases, more OSs. We'll need to, at some point, deal with the deprecation of the Nova file injection. Trove does depend on that, so that's something that's coming up. And we touched upon this a little yesterday. We'd like to do better isolation of the guest instances from the control plane. That's been one of those architectural issues that we'd like to tackle. So I think that's it for, let's see. Okay, actually, before I wrap up, I'd like to say, Trove's gone through a lot of change, churn in the community, and the level of contributions, and the number of companies contributing. So I do have a few asks. We definitely would love to have more reviews of code, more reviews of documentation. There's a fairly sizable backlog, so bug fixes and documentation updates are appreciated as well. There's some lead features that we talked about, the image creation tool, the better isolation. We'd like to have individuals come up and lead those features. We'll love their contributions. You do that by developing and writing, but it's not just writing the blueprints. We'd also appreciate if you could review other blueprints as well. I put in the feedback from the forum, link in there. Feel free to go add things to that. Hang out at the OpenStack Trove IRC channel. Ping us. We'll try to answer questions. This is a good way of learning and getting your questions answered. We do have a weekly meeting Wednesdays at 1500 UTC, so on OpenStack Meeting Alt, so show up there as well if you want to participate. So that's how to contribute and provide feedback. So I'll stop there and take questions. Anything you guys like to see in the future?
Well, I have a small question regarding Project Horde. One of your developers mentioned in some chats, so we are now about to integrate Trove in our OpenStack subset of OpenStack services we provide our clients with. And so concerning some architectural decisions that have been made in Trove concerning this isolation stuff, common RPC bus, which involves control plane and instances. So we would like to know where the development will be, what will be drive to. I mean, will this new project, Horde, will be the major focus, or Trove will be developing and fixing, the Trove team will be fixing these bugs in Trove and develop it with...
Good question. Very good question. I don't know that I want to take questions on Horde. I think Amrit's leading that project. I'd encourage you to talk with him after the session. That'd probably be the best way to kind of continue that discussion.
So you mentioned about this guest theme isolation. So there are some more specific things that you want to do with it?
Yeah, I think there's some. We reviewed some proposal yesterday. We'd like to have a blueprint written on that, and then review that blueprint. So.
Let me suggest, if you're interested on that specific topic, maybe after the session, when we finish, we could sit down and discuss what the blueprint would look like. Just like you guys, we're really interested in, what could be the next generation of something like Trove. But being realistic and pragmatic, we need database as a service working on our cloud now. So if we can get that, because whatever we're developing, it might take some time. So we're really interested in finding a solution that allows us to deploy, service customers right now, and then make changes and decisions later.
All right. Any other questions? Any other Trove questions?
There was a bunch of database supported, but as far as I remember, is there any already considered as a stable?
MySQL is probably the one that's the most stable and gets the most tested. Gets tested every day. So that's definitely the most stable. Everything else is marked experimental, and I don't know that those need to be marked experimental. So that's one of the reasons I said,
So there is, because I haven't seen that on the rest of the slide, that there is some progress in this area for the queens.
Oh, for queens, you mean?
If we will do if there is planned some progress on the...
Yeah, I think I might have touched upon that somewhere, but part of moving those non-voting, a lot of the non-voting tests are related to the other databases. So once we get them voting, we feel confident in stability and maturity, then we can promote it, and then we can remove that tag as well. So. Right. Any other questions?
What about maintenance then?
So I think I was able to convince the TC to not put the maintenance tag on for cycle 02. If we're able to accomplish all the goals here, I don't think we'll go on. But if that really depends on the community and how many contributors we get and how far we can push it. So definitely doesn't have the tag right now, and we hope it won't. It's TBD. All right, any questions? All right, thank you.